Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another video. This is a video I've actually wanted to film for a really long time. I have wanted to show you all of the books in my life that have inspired me to write, aka my favorite books of all time. There are so many, and there are so many from multiple genres, really across genres, anywhere from romance to classics to sci-fi, fantasy, nonfiction, even some journalism is represented in here. I've written my entire life, and I've written essentially everything from poetry to more long form to nonfiction to fiction. I studied journalism, so none of these books are actually about the craft of writing and how to write. I studied it for 4 years, and it was a very intensive course. Actually really intense, like fail you if you make a single mistake kind of intense. So in university, we really focused on the craft of writing in a way that frankly nauseated me. I think that there are so many great resources out there on how to write and how to write well. And actually, I do plan on reading Stephen King's On Writing by the end of this year. I really want to dive into that. But to be honest, the things that inspire me most to write are things that I experienced that I love so much, and I don't know, it's hard to explain, I guess. I read something and I love it so deeply and dearly that it inspires me to want to write something that makes me feel like that, if that makes sense. So without further ado, let me get into some of my favorite books of all time. Some of these I've talked about, but I think actually the majority of them I haven't. So hopefully this is a little bit of insight into my reading and writing journey and the various stories that I hold so very dear in my heart. So I think I'm gonna go in order of having read these books. I think that would be really fun to do and see if I can remember. So I'm going to start with the book that made me fall in love with books. The book that made me, I always loved reading before reading this book. I loved reading like Winnie the Pooh and like Charlotte's Web and like Anne of Green Gables. Like those books I've read before this book, but I think that this story was the first time I read a book and felt like I saw myself in the pages, and I got that sense of wonder and awe that I only get from my very favorite works, and that is The Outsiders. I just knocked over a ton of books. I think that this story made me fall in love with books. It made me realize that books could make you feel something much stronger than any other medium of storytelling, and I saw myself in Ponyboy so very much. I resonated with him, with his emotional intelligence. And I just loved this story. I read this book so many times that my like super cool party trick was that I could recite the first page from heart. And I also have the uncut director's edition of The Outsiders. And yes, I make my friends watch it all the time. I actually recently made my friends watch it like a few months ago. With each book, I kind of want to talk a little bit about what specifically about the book inspired me. So I won't necessarily talk about what the book is about. But with this one, I think it was just the strength of the main character. Like I said, I saw myself in Ponyboy so much, and I think it was probably the first time I ever read a book where I felt like the character was real. And so that was like just such a strong, visceral experience for me, and I will forever hold a place in my heart for The Outsiders. Okay, this one's a little odd. It's odd because of the time that I read it, and like I said, I am going in order, and I think that this would have been the next book in my life that changed my life. And I was very young when I read this book. I will say that. I was very young, but I do not care. And my mom didn't care, and the only person who seemed to care was a TA who told me that I was too young to read this book, but I wasn't. I was very emotionally mature, and again, it ignited a love of this particular genre that carries on through this day. And that book, my friends, is the super, super popular Outlander. And now I have so many editions of this book, but my favorite edition, and I believe I've shown it before, is this first edition, and it was actually published as cross stitch. This is a super, super rare first edition hardcover that I actually met Diana Gabaldon and she signed it, which was fantastic. Tom bought this for me and I love it so, so very much. I read this book when I was in grade 8, and this was the first book in my life that I could not put down. I could not stop reading it. I remember reading it during lunch break, sitting at my desk eating like my sandwich. I remember going out for recess and sitting in a corner and reading this book. And I remember coming home from school and reading this book late into the night. And I just loved it so very much. And it ignited a love for historical fiction in a way that changed my life, truly, because without this book, I don't think I would have fallen so hard in love with historical fiction. When I was in university, I studied history as a minor, and a lot of my courses were wrapped up in history, and one of my favorite courses talked about how fictionalized telling of history is actually really important for storytelling and for igniting love of history. And as a way to blend a fictionalized story with real events, this was exceptional, and it really did make me fall in love with books in a way that I, at that point, hadn't realized could be possible. So yes, I was in grade 8, I was reading it. Yes, it is a little bit of a mature book for someone who is in grade 8. I am the youngest child of 3 by quite a bit, 4 or 5 years of a gap difference. So I was always kind of a mature child, and my mom knew that I could handle it. And she honestly was like, as long as you're reading, I don't really care what you're reading. And I thank her so much for that, because honestly, without her, I don't think I would have fallen in love with books as much as I have. So with this one, it really was the blending of history and fiction that completely changed my life. I'm gonna say I read this one next. This is really fun for me, actually, because I'm like trying to remember the order in which these books changed my life. Oh my gosh, I'll be right with you. Edgar Allan Poe. He made me fall in love with horror fiction. The Telltale Heart, The Raven. I remember reading those in grade 8 and just being completely bewildered that something so lyrical and beautifully written could be so terrifying and visceral, and that ignited a love for Poe that continues through this day. He is one of my favorite writers, and I just acquired this volume and I'm so excited to go through it because I haven't actually read him since I was in grade 8, and I just really remember loving him. And he also introduced me to poetry. I was not a big poetry fan until I read Mr. Poe, and deeply inspired me to start writing poetry. I actually wrote poetry for the longest stretch of my life. I've written poetry longer than I think any other form. I used to write it exclusively in high school. Every day I would write a poem in my journal, and they were not all good, I assure you, but I loved writing poetry. And that brings me to the next writer. I don't know about you, but I think I will always remember the day in class when we read The Lottery for the first time. I will never forget reading the story and getting to the end of The Lottery and just sitting there and being like, holy crap. Shirley Jackson, I've talked about her in previous videos. She is one of my favorite writers, and the reason why she inspires me to write is she creates the most insane stories, in the sense that when you are reading them, you do not realize how wrong they are, and she makes something seem so innocent and then twists it, and you are uncomfortable and you're not sure how to feel about these characters. And the way that she dives into human psychology around fear and around hatred and violence, it is unmatched, and she is truly an inspiration. Her and Poe really sit neck and neck for my favorite horror writers. It's really hard for me to pick a favorite. I'm going to say the next book that I read was also in grade 8, and that is The Hobbit. I can list the number of people in my life who, like real people that I've interacted with, who changed my life for the better, and one of them was my grade 8 teacher. And he was the first person to tell me that I should be a writer. He actually specifically said, you should be a writer and not a journalist. And oh my goodness, how right he was. He saw something in my writing that to this day I'm so grateful for. I'm so grateful for. He completely changed my life. But long-winded way of saying he was obsessed with Tolkien, and he taught The Hobbit in a way that made me realize how your life could influence your work. And I know now as an adult, or maybe even as a big reader, I feel like it's common knowledge the various things that influenced Tolkien in his writing. But when I was in grade 8, I knew nothing about him other than the fact that he wrote The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, but I hadn't read any of his works up until that point. I actually wasn't a big fantasy reader at that point. But reading The Hobbit and taking a step back from it and learning about how his time in the war influenced various elements of The Hobbit, and how his environmentalism influenced elements of The Hobbit, and the way that he crafted those real-world experiences into a story, I think really ignited that passion for storytelling within myself, and my ability to use real-world examples and turn them into emotion on page. So not necessarily writing my own experiences verbatim, but taking my experiences and being able to craft them into a scene so that the emotion translates was something that I think I learned inherently when we studied The Hobbit, because I did not think about books in the way that I did after reading this book. And that is that they really are an imprint of the author and the writer and the storyteller that sits behind them. And The Hobbit, of course, in its own right, is a brilliant, brilliant piece of work, a piece of literature, a piece of writing, a story. It's brilliant. It deserves all of its accolades, obviously. But I think what I really took away from it was the craftsmanship of writing and how brilliant Tolkien really was when it comes to that specific element, because obviously he's brilliant in so many ways. So I plan to do a reread, I think, over Christmas of all of these books, because I just really want to experience his writing again, because his writing is phenomenal. And so yeah, grade 8, one of the books that ultimately changed my life. Okay, I think that these are all kind of the same area, around the same time in my life. These were high school Megan books. High school Megan books. Are you ready for it? Because there were a lot of random ones that changed my life. Let's start with the one that I've already talked about extensively in a video. That is Dave Eggers' A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius. I recently reread this in one of my reading vlogs because this was actually probably my favorite book from high school. It was the book that really made me realize that I was meant to write. I said a lot about Dave Eggers in that video, but the thing that I will say for this particular video was that it was his writing that really inspired me to keep writing, because his tone, I can totally see his tone in my high school writing. I was surly and a little gruff and a little sharp, and I still have elements of that in my own writing now, but I totally can see high school Megan's complete obsession with Dave Eggers in her own writing, and I think it really helped me to craft humor within my own writing and stories, and for that I will forever be grateful to Mr. Dave Eggers. Yes, okay. This is one that I have not read as an adult, so I don't know how it holds up. But it doesn't really matter because, well, frankly, I actually have a tattoo from this book. So it really doesn't matter because her words are permanently etched on my skin. And I remember reading this book. For an essay, or it was like a book study. I can't remember. It was like one of those things where I had to basically read chunks of it and then write essays based on those chunks, but they were more like personal reactions. And I remember reading the line that is tattooed on my body and writing to my teacher, who I think it was like grade 10, and saying, I'm going to get this tattooed on my body. Like that was in an assignment. It was in writing, and lo and behold, like 3 years later, it happened. And to have read The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath's writing is phenomenal. Say what you will about, there's so much information about her life, and she's painted as such a tragic figure that I think it overshadows a lot of the conversation around how actually brilliant she was as a writer. Her writing is crisp, it's clean, it's beautiful. The way that she constructs sentences to make you feel, in my mind, it has been unmatched. Again, I haven't read this as an adult, so I do want to reread it, but if you are curious, the line that I have on my body is I am, which is from a very pivotal moment from this story, and really, really heartfelt and really meaningful to me. And I think with Plath, much like with Ponyboy, I related to this book a lot. And I think that I saw a representation of myself within these pages, not wholly, not completely, but in a way that just really, really stuck with me. And Sylvia Plath will forever be one of my favorite writers as a result. And I also think that this introduced me to the idea of an autobiography, and again, that blending of fiction with reality, that actually, frankly, is quite a theme in a lot of these books. Even with the heartbreaking work of Staggering Genius and The Hobbit, you can argue that there were real world elements blended into those stories, and this kind of was my first actual read of an autobiography where that is a part of the genre and a part of writing. I just remember high school Megan being so in love with that book and so in love with her writing. And it's funny because I annotated this book in high school, and I would love to like go through and reread it and see what I thought about it. So precisely what I'm gonna do. Okay, I'm gonna talk about this book because I don't remember a lot about this book, but this book has followed me my entire life. So much so that I'm actually going to reread the trilogy, and that is Regeneration by Pat Barker. This is a epic story of World War I, particularly mental health in World War I, and we follow a soldier throughout his experience with dealing with the mental repercussions of serving in such a horrific war. And this really, I think for obvious reasons, has followed me throughout my life because I've always been fascinated with the history of World War I, in particular the soldier psyche. Throughout my entire university career, I was fixated on shell shock and studying shell shock and studying our response, our being the Canadian government's response to shell shock in World War I, and the kind of treatment of veterans post World War I and during World War I. But it again blends that history and fiction, a time in history and the treatment of people in history in a way that I feel like only a fictionalized account could, because, you know, she puts words in these people's mouths that we don't know if they've said, or you know, she takes you into the hospital room, into the treatments. And this really, again, inspired me when it came to historical fiction, because unlike Outlander, where yes, there's a lot of history that is accurate, and you know, there are real people that Diana Gabaldon is introducing into that story, this book actually follows real world people who were trying to treat shell shock. And I think that Pat Barker was quite respectful of that and quite aware of that, so it almost reads like a history book in a way. Anyway, this one inspired so many essays, so many journalistic pieces on shell shock. It follows me my entire life. It inspired the folk, that's World War I, fantasy, and so I'm very, very grateful for this book, and I will definitely reread it as an adult. This book, Jurassic Park. This book is probably my favorite science fiction. I think that that's fair because frankly I don't read a lot of science fiction, but this book was my entire grade 12 year. My grade 12 English. I spent an entire year studying this book, cover to cover, writing endless essays on it, doing a presentation on chaos theory, and all of these things. And I think with this story, what really inspired me in my own writing was the ability to portray a message. Now, I think maybe if I read this as an adult, I would feel like the message is a little on the nose throughout the pages, perhaps. Michael Crichton had a message that he wanted to portray about man's relationship to science and man's relationship to nature, and he did it. He did it wonderfully, and is really, really important. And I think that it made me feel like books can be fictionalized, but also be important and hold messages that are timeless and that need to be told to people. This, in fairness, is not really a book. This is the one of two books that are inspirations in my life to write and to write well, that are not actually books. But I do have a book that represents who I'm going to talk about, and that is Mr. Bob Dylan, particularly his writing up into the year of 1966. I'm a very big fan of early Bob Dylan, and I discovered him in high school, and he, like everything else, completely changed my life. I love, love, love his poetry. I love his songs. I think that for me, it's not necessarily about the music itself, but the way that he tells stories within his lyrics. I think that with Bob Dylan, you kind of either, I don't want to say you get it or you don't, because that makes it sound like if you don't get it, you're ignorant. I think it's more just like you're in or you're not, you know, like you feel it or you don't, and that's totally fine. I think I would never push, and people in my life can attest to this, I do not push Bob Dylan on anybody. I think my experience with his writing is incredibly personal, and I just love the way he crafts sentences. I love his poetry. So many people on this list are poets, and I think that poetry is a really interesting form to practice writing in, because you have to say something short and simple and sweet, and it has to be clear, and it has to evoke an image, and his writing does that, and it really obviously has inspired me my whole life to create and to keep going and to be able to portray images in the way that he does. So when I was in university, I worked at a Canadian military magazine, and I spent some time there as a journalist, and one of my assignments was actually going to speak to David Finkel. David Finkel is, he was granted a MacArthur Genius Grant, and he also won a Pulitzer Prize. And I went to speak with him, and it was in a time of my life that was pretty rough, and I was not loving the place that I was in. It was really, really hard, and frankly, I just wanted to give up everything. I had no idea what to do with my life. And he was so generous and so gracious to this young reporter who was supposed to be coming in and doing an interview, but wasn't actually given a clear assignment and had no idea what was expected of me. I was really, really young, and I went in and we just talked. We talked about writing, and we talked about crafting sentences, and he was so generous, and it was such a kind conversation where he encouraged me. He talked about the power of the first line of a book, which is one of the bigger things that I took away from him and his writing. And it was just really, really life-changing. I walked away from that interview thinking, oh, okay, not all writers are mean, which I know that sounds silly, but I had been pretty devastated my life thus far, essentially meeting my heroes. With this, he just taught me that people can be generous with their time, even if they're brilliant. And he actually wrote in this book, "To Megan, nice to meet you. I have a feeling I'll be reading your writing down the line. I hope so. David Finkel." Like, he just was so, so kind and generous, and he is a brilliant, brilliant writer. And again, his work that I particularly love focuses on PTSD after the war in Afghanistan and the soldiers that came back and their lack of treatment, I will say, by society. And I just obviously resonate with those kinds of stories, and he writes them masterfully, and he was so gracious. He was so gracious. There are very few writers I've met in my life that are gracious and kind and willing to just like put away the ego and help a struggling young journalist out, and he did, and I will forever, ever hold a place in my heart for him and for that. So since we're still on the theme of journalism, and at this point all of these books are like most recent reads, and by most recent I mean like maybe like 5 years, maybe 6, maybe 7. I don't know. How long have I been out of university? What is time anymore? I'm going to talk about a book that I actually don't have represented because it is not a book, but I have it on a little post-it note because he is a formative influence on my writing now, and that is Ta-Nehisi Coates, and in particular his journalism. I know he was super famous for Between the World and Me, and he also has a fantasy book which I thought I had on my shelf called The Water Dancer, but I can't find it anywhere, and I really do want to read it. But in particular, the work that I'm talking about is The Case for Reparations. I'm going to link it down below. It's an Atlantic article, and oh my goodness, it is probably one of the greatest forms of journalism, of modern journalism, to this day. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a brilliant long-form journalist, and the way that he blends arguments with real-world examples and just his writing, his actual sentence structure is so crisp, and I particularly love listening to his interviews on the Longform podcast, which I will also link down below. Whenever I'm feeling down in my writing, he is so honest and open in those interviews about his journey with writing and how he absolutely hates his older stuff and how, you know, it's a craft and you have to work at it, and here's how you work at it. And he is honest with writing in a way that I feel like not many writers are. A lot of writers just kind of like to pretend that it isn't something that is attainable for everybody, if that makes sense. I feel like there's a little bit of like a special, like, it's a talent. No, it's a craft. Like, you can hone it. Everyone can be a writer. And Ta-Nehisi Coates really makes me feel like that when he talks about his writing. But The Case for Reparations, I highly recommend that you read it. It is, again, in my mind, probably the most brilliant piece of modern journalism in probably the last decade or so. I think I would stand by that. I read it every once in a while on like a lunch break when I'm just like feeling like it, because it is just a brilliant story. In fact, all of his long form journalism is definitely worth reading, but that one in particular just jumps out for me. So Ta-Nehisi Coates definitely inspires me to keep writing and just practice it, and know that you don't have to be brilliant at it, even though he is brilliant. You don't have to be brilliant at it or feel like you're brilliant at it in order to do that. I think that's the key thing, is you don't have to feel like you're brilliant at writing to write. You just write. And here's how you construct a story. And I could go on about Ta-Nehisi Coates, but I will stop because, again, he's one of my favorite writers. Okay, I'm gonna talk about one that always makes me insecure when I talk about it, because I don't want to come off as like, but it really did change my life. It changed my life, and I'm so glad that I read it, and that is War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. And I picked this up last year, and I picked it up at a particularly rough patch in my life where I was feeling really down, and I just thought, you know what? It has been a life goal of mine to read War and Peace. The time is now. I'm just gonna do it. And I didn't actually know if I was gonna get through it or if I was gonna like it. I have always held it up on a pedestal in my life, thinking that it would be a life goal. It is brilliant. Newsflash, War and Peace is brilliant. War and Peace is a blending of genres in a masterful way. And there are so many things that inspired me about this book, but I think the key thing for this video that I will talk about is Tolstoy's just complete blend of genres. You know, he wrote this, and the whole time in his diaries was unsure if it was even gonna be something, because it is part story, it is part history, it is part essay. It is unlike anything I've ever read before, in the sense that it is all of those things done brilliantly. There are not many books that could get away with telling a story with characters and with an arc and with all of these things, and then stepping away from that story and just writing history essays and writing essays on fate. But he does it, and it is so inspiring to just write what you want to write. I think that was my big thing when I came away from this, is that Tolstoy was clearly in love with this history and clearly wanted to write this history. And he did it, and he did it in a way that no one else has ever done it, and it worked. Oh my gosh, it worked. Did it ever work? Because I think that this is considered one of the greatest novels of all time, and rightfully so. So for me, when I read this, I realized, okay, this is my call to like just write what I want to read. Just write what I want to write, and write something that I would love to read. That is what I tell myself every time I sit down to write, and that creeping feeling of like, is this worthy of being told? Like, is this a good story? Are people gonna like this? I always stop myself and I think, nope, you're just writing this for yourself, and you're writing something that you would want to read, and you're writing things that you find interesting. And I guess that's the Tolstoy life lesson that has made me a better writer, because it really has. I don't know how he did it, but it is absolutely a brilliant, brilliant work of art. Last, but definitely not least, I'm saving this one for last because it is my favorite book of all time. It is a very personal favorite, so I don't necessarily recommend that you read this. I think that you should look at Goodreads, you should look at the reviews, and there are some really good counterpoints to why this book is not that great on Goodreads. So definitely check it out. But for me, for me, it is the best book of all time. And I'm laughing because the like 5 friends of mine that watch my videos are probably chuckling right now, because to know me is to know that I love this book and what this book means to me. And I think you can tell alone by how many copies of this book that I have. And that is The Bronze Horseman by Paulina Simons. I remember being in the biggest, not the biggest like book hangover, because I still read, but I remember reading Outlander and just feeling like I would never read another book that made me feel the way Outlander made me feel, which is that I could not stop reading it, that I could stay up till 5 a.m. and read it, and then wake up the next day and just want to keep reading it. And when I met Tom, he was determined to find me a book that was like that, and he found some really great books for me, and one of these books was The Bronze Horseman. And we would always be around Indigo or like at a bookstore, and I would be looking for a book, and he would tell me, you should pick this book up. And I would pick it up and I would read the back, and like the back just does not do it justice. And I would like read the first sentence and be like, no, like this sounds so bad, like I'm not reading this. And then finally I was like, okay, fine, I'm gonna read it. I'll read it, like fine, whatever. And I could not put it down. And it was the first book in years since Outlander, so we're talking from like grade 8 all the way till university, that made me feel that way, that I had to keep reading it. I see myself so much in the pages of these books. I say these books because it's a trilogy, although the first book is really just like the best book of the series. But there are just elements of this story that I see myself in, and what inspired me about this book in particular when it comes to writing is, again, that feeling of like, I can write a love story, and I can admit openly that I love love stories, because I think that there's so much conversation around romance and like love in stories and epic love and things like that, that I struggled with admitting that I liked. Not that I struggled with admitting that I liked it, but I didn't realize how much it meant for me to read a love story. I hope that is making sense, because I think that this book really did make me realize that my favorite books of all time are about love, and not just love that I discovered my favorite trope in this book, which is 2 people want to be together, but the entire world is ripping them apart. I love those kinds of romances. I love it when I'm not a big fan of like enemies to lovers, or will they, won't they, or like anything like that. I love it when they're in love, but they can't be. And so this book is the epitome of that. It sent me on another like historical deep dive into the history of Leningrad in World War II. And then that sent me even back further to the Russian Revolution. And that has ignited a love of Russian literature, and really just opened up the gates. Without this book, I don't think I ever would have read War and Peace. I don't think I would have read as many Russian literature books as I have. and it just really changed my life. And I don't think that I could ever accurately talk about what this book means to me, but it just means a lot, and it is the epitome of a love story for me. And whenever I'm writing, I try to strive to emulate that kind of epic love. Whether I succeed or not, I don't know, but that is the Bronze Horseman, and I could go on, but I shall not, because I've gone on for a very long time. Those are all the books. I mean, there are so, as I said at the beginning, there are so many things in my life that have inspired me to write that aren't just books. You know, I could talk about like games, I could talk about music, I could talk about all of the things, because there are so many things. Like Dermot Kennedy is another writer whose writing inspires me so much. And I could go on and on. I think the key thing is just being inspired for me is enough for me to sit down every day and want to write and want to keep going. And I'm so grateful for all of these books in my life, and this was such a fun little like deep dive into the stories in my life that kind of kept me going and propelled me. I feel like my writing journey is just a train on a track that will not stop. No matter what in my life, I will always write, but these books just kind of gave me a little bit of an extra push and reminded me why I was on this journey, and for that I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful for all of the past and present writers out there who are just killing it and doing wonderful, wonderful things, and I want to thank you for watching this video. If you watched it all the way to the end, thank you for being here. Let me know down below some of the things that inspire you to write, whether they're books or movies or something. I would love to know, because I'm just like always down to like experience new stories and new voices. So thank you so very much for watching, and I will check back in with you later.